So when we think of the building blocks of design, we're specifically talking about line, shape, texture, value, and color. And that's with 2D design and as well later when we start looking at 3D design. Let's talk about the basic, most primary element, which is just line itself, which can be defined as a point in motion, a series of adjacent points, a connection between points, and any implied connection between points. And we'll look at some examples here in a minute to discuss that further. But we also want to talk a little bit about line quality. The orientation of the line refers to the horizontal or vertical diagonal position of the line. The dynamic lines are diagonal and curving. They can suggest movement and change. Static lines are horizontal lines and suggest stability. So vertical lines can be either static or dynamic depending on the context in which they're used. When we talk about direction in general with a line, it can refer to the implied movement of the line and the weight of the line, so how thin or how thick it is will accentuate that direction. Swelling suggests outward movement, while shrinking is going to suggest inward movement. Continuity or linear flow can really enhance direction. Continuous lines generate a stronger sense of direction than a broken or jagged line. Let's look at some examples. So on your left, we have some examples of line variations. This is, when we mentioned that a series of adjacent points can form a line, these are all lines as well here, even though they're not actually connecting these dots. We talked a little bit about direction of the line and the implied movement, and you can see the thicker lines as we move upwards, they taper out in most cases. This one's a little bit thicker throughout, but it suggests upward movement and leads our eye through the image plane. A good example of really the basics of line can be seen in this contemporary oil painting by Massamo Tacon. You can see these interesting lines that are intersecting around the edges, sort of creating a spinning effect, and then this very chaotic use of line that's in the middle that's almost splatter. It also continues the idea of movement in a circular form with the heavier strokes over here and the lighter strokes sort of down towards this 7 o'clock area, if you're looking at it like the face of a clock. And then it's contrasted with these very, very geometric straight lines that are forming this pattern that sort of encases this whole image. So you'll be working a lot with different types of line in your first assignment and through this first week of class. So let's talk about different types of lines. Actual lines describe anything really that's a complex form, and it can enclose a space to create a shape. There's all types of ways. It's something concrete and visual that you really understand immediately. Contour lines, again, this idea of volume and space, enclose to create a form. Calligraphic lines are flowing and expressive and vary in thickness. Organizational lines create a linear skeleton on which the composition can be built. And implied lines, we talked about that a little bit in the first slide. They suggest connections and kind of lead our eye through the image. We'll go into a little bit more about linear networks, but just be aware that they create the illusion of space, and hatching, cross-hatching, and cross-contours can help us define both shading and surface of shape and objects to give a sense of volume. So here we have a nice example of a contour line drawing. This area up here, you see these lines that suggest the edges of the shape, and we fill in a little bit by how close or how far away. We can get a somewhat of a sense of depth here. We've got this calligraphic line that sort of varies in thin and thickness, and anybody who's seen old lettering has probably seen a calligraphic line. And then here's some various examples of hatching and cross-hatching. Hatching and cross-hatching can be used to define shape, volume, anything that will have the shade or the way we perceive the way light affects surface of a two-dimensional object. So it's interesting then to think of these basic principles and look at a very complex image. Here we have Caravaggio's The Disposition. deposition. Sorry about that. You can see the details of this image are somewhat lost in the shadows. We see sort of a hint of a face here. The loss of definitions becomes a strength in this image instead of the weakness because it helps us form connections. Connections are made through closure, so we have to think about, okay, there's something here. It makes our brain work. It stimulates our imagination, what's going on. Not only does it lend itself to the mood itself of the painting, but you can see it broken down in a way as you think about each different piece and element and the flow, this kind of nice curvilinear flow that runs through the whole composition. In this more contemporary piece, lines are used in a little bit different way. They're used as a background to kind of build this idea of momentum and space back here. We've got lines that create a sense of perspective, both with the xylophone and keyboard here, and then curvilinear, interesting lines, as well as lines that are defining various shapes in this image. Line can be used to define, enclose, connect, or disconnect, as we've learned before. The edge of the page is always thought of as the first set of lines in any image, unless you're working in a circle and then it's one continuous line. But if you think about the traditional format of the rectangle or square work of art, the first lines in the image are those edges, and as well with the circle. This is known as the format, and you should definitely think about this as you're planning your compositions during the course of this class. So for our next little building block of design, let's talk a little bit about shape. And again, we've talked a little bit about it's a flat enclosed area surrounded by a line. It's surrounded by that idea of the contour line. You can also surround it with other shapes. So if you put 4 squares and left a little space in the center, that would be surrounded by another shape. Filling the area with a solid or a texture can help define that shape, and then filling the area with color or texture. That's another possibility. So let's look at different types of shapes. A shape that is distinguished from the background is called a positive shape or figure. Got a different figure-ground relationships here. The area around the figure is known as the negative shape or ground. You might also hear the terms positive space and negative space. All these terms are pretty much used interchangeably, and they're all correct. So whatever seems right to you, if you're more used to calling it positive space, then that's fine. I will understand what you're talking about. Anyway, the area around the figure is known as the negative shape or ground, as I mentioned, and figure ground reversal occurs when the positive, then the negative shapes command attention. And you can see these are 2 different examples of that idea of figure ground reversal here. And then we can see this also happening in the M.C. Escher sky and water image, this woodcut from 1938. So wonderful. Escher's really interesting to look at, and I'll use him as an example a lot for you, but he's got a great sense, a great graphic quality to his work. Very bold, solid lines, very defined shapes, usually black and white, although there are a couple of works that have color. But very interesting. If you want to check out an artist, he's a good one if you're not familiar with him. So like the lines, we have some different types of shapes. Rectilinear shapes are composed of straight lines with angled corners. Curvilinear shapes, as it would suggest, have curves and are flowing in their edges. Rectilinear shapes are also known, or can also contribute to the idea of this geometric shape, and it's crisp, precise edged, and mathematically consistent curve. So you can also have some curving in something that's a geometric object. So if you think if you're drawing something, or if you see someone drawing something and they're drawing a human form, that is more of an organic shape. That's things found in the natural world. And then geometric shapes would be like a car or a building or something of that nature that you might draw or depict in some way. Here are some examples of some different types of shapes. We've got rectilinear shapes, curvilinear shapes. Here are some volumes. This is using that hatching as shading, as I mentioned earlier, with different lines that are applied very closely together. Here's the idea of some geometry with this, starting with just a basic triangle and moving through different iterations of adding that and duplicating it and spinning, which is kind of an interesting way to look at that. And then organic shape in this very simple drawing of a piece of coral. Now let's have a little fun. I'm going to pause here for just a minute and let you take a look at this image. It's very detailed, so it's kind of fun to break down all the different types of shapes you see. We'll be talking about texture soon, and there's certainly a lot of different types of texture. It creates the illusion of space. We can see that the distance is far off, and this table, or the things that are more in the center and larger in the frame, we view as being closer. So there's a lot of different principles of design at work here. Very simple line forms as well, and used as patterning with the line and defining the brickwork here. So there's really a lot going on here that we could talk about. So just take a minute to take it in, look at it, see if you notice anything interesting. I think there are things that pop out for me every time I look at this image a little differently. For instance, I love this texture here that look like sort of artichoke leaves stacking up towards this circle. I think that's interesting organic form and the way that moves through. It's a little ode to Picasso here with a Picasso painting that's been inserted into the frame. It's been cut out to form a shadow and a false shadow in the background. So there's just a lot of interesting stuff going on in here. So we have different types of shapes as we saw in the previous image. Some of them are representational shapes, and they're derived basically from subject matter. It's anything you observe in life, right? So that would be, easier to identify. Abstract shapes are derived from visual reality, but they can be transformed and reduce their resemblance to the original source. So abstraction doesn't necessarily look like anything you've observed in nature, but it can also, I think of there's a wonderful Salvador Dali piece, which is an abstraction that I'm going to pull up, but it's a figurative abstraction, and I'll show that to you right now. Okay, this is a very famous work of art by Salvador Dali, and you can see it's very organic shapes with the animals, but there's also this abstraction that's happened with the limbs and sort of the exaggeration of the way these things are created. It's not the traditional abstraction we think of when we look at something like Mark Rothko, and I'll show an example of his work next. So here's an example of very simple color field painting. These are quite large canvases, and some people really love Rothko, some people don't. We're not really judging the value or whether we like the art or not. We're really just looking at it in terms of the principles of design, where he's used these different lines to define this form, as well as the shapes. We can see a movement from figurative to abstraction in the works of Pablo Picasso. This is a piece called The Old Guitarist. We saw a reference to that in the other artwork we were looking at earlier. And it's from 1903. In 1912, Picasso is still painting guitars, but you can see he's begun to experiment with the way the lines and shapes can be moved around and rearranged in the composition. So this is the first example of distilling from real life. We saw the old man with the guitar, much more representational of what we typically see in an observation, to something where he's beginning towards abstraction. Also from 1912, Picasso's painting of guitar and violin further breaks things down and heads more towards his signature cubism work of the later years. And here we see Picasso moving towards pure abstraction. This is still a guitar. You can see the sound hole here and some of the shapes that we're used to seeing in the curves of a guitar, but it really has just been broken down and distilled into a series of lines and shapes that are shaded from some concept or observation of a guitar. It becomes a very different type of work of art when we look at something like this, of course, then we go back to the original guitar player. To this version of this is the original guitar player that we looked at initially, to this version. So that should give you some sense of abstraction and kind of how it works in the thought process of the artist, where you start out with an original and sort of break things down and distill them. In Picasso's case, looking at just those very basic building blocks of design, line, shape, and volume,